I was hired to plan the perfect billionaire wedding. My rules were simple: control the logistics and never get emotionally involved. But as I stood in the private dressing room, adjusting Emma's $100,000 gown, the bride wasn't looking at her reflection. She stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and backed me against the door. "You don't really want me to marry him?" she whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips. I arrived at the Fifth Avenue bridal boutique exactly 45 minutes before the client. That was my primary rule in this industry. Control the environment before the environment has a chance to control you. I had already instructed the staff to adjust the overhead lighting to mimic the late afternoon September sun. I had them remove all the champagne from the VIP lounge, replacing it with sparkling water and sliced cucumber. Emma didn't drink alcohol before noon, a minor detail her own fiancé hadn't even known when I conducted their initial couples interview. I had arranged the velvet seating so Julian would have a direct line of sight to the pedestal, minimizing the chance of his attention wandering. It was a flawless setup, a masterclass in psychological and environmental manipulation. But none of my careful planning mattered the moment Emma Hayes walked through the heavy glass doors. Hold your breath for just a second. I kept my voice entirely neutral, sliding another silver pin into the heavy layers of ivory Duchess satin. The private fitting suite was impeccably silent. Thick velvet curtains muffled the chaotic symphony of Manhattan traffic outside, leaving only the faint mechanical hum of the climate control. In the towering floor-to-ceiling mirror, Emma looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. She was a breathtaking, flawless centerpiece crafted for a billionaire's upcoming social conquest. But as I knelt behind her, adjusting the hemline with practiced precision, I noticed the underlying tension. The muscles in her lower back were pulled taut, rigid and unforgiving beneath the delicate French lace. Julian, the groom, had been in this very room exactly 15 minutes ago. He had paced the edge of the plush carpet, barking orders into a Bluetooth earpiece about offshore accounts and corporate mergers. He hadn't even looked at Emma when she stepped out of the dressing room. Instead, he had checked his gold Rolex and tapped my shoulder, a gesture that immediately set my teeth on edge. "You handle this, Sarah," he had instructed, already walking backward toward the oak double doors. "Make sure she goes with the cathedral train, because it looks spectacular in drone footage." And just like that, he was gone. He left behind the faint scent of expensive scotch and the heavy, suffocating reality of a transactional marriage. I was entirely used to this dynamic. In the world of high society weddings, romance was an unpredictable liability, and efficiency was the only currency that mattered. "You can exhale now," I said, rising gracefully to my feet. I brushed a non-existent speck of dust from the thigh of my tailored charcoal pantsuit. Emma let out a breath, but the rigidity in her shoulders remained completely unchanged. Through the reflection in the antique glass, her piercing green eyes found mine. She wasn't looking at the intricate beadwork or the plunging neckline of the dress. She was staring directly at me, studying my face with an intensity that felt entirely unearned and strangely invasive. "Is the bodice too restrictive?" I asked, picking up my leather-bound tablet to log the necessary alterations. "I can have the head seamstress loosen the interior ribbing by 1/4 inch before the final fiddle next month." Emma didn't answer immediately. Her silence stretched out in the room, thick and deliberate, forcing me to wait in the quiet. "It's not the ribs," she finally said. Her voice was low, a soft, slow cadence that always made me feel like I was rushing carelessly through my own life. "It's everything," she added, her fingers lightly grazing the satin skirt as if it were a physical confinement. I tapped the glass screen of my device, deliberately breaking our shared gaze in the mirror. "Let's be efficient. We have 3 other designers waiting in the lounge downstairs." "Julian likes this one," she stated, though the words sounded incredibly hollow. "Julian prefers the silhouette," I corrected her smoothly, retreating instantly into my polished professional armor. It projects stability, heritage, and unquestionable elegance, which is exactly what his board of directors expects. Emma turned around slowly, ignoring the delicate fabric dragging against the carpet. She stepped off the velvet pedestal, bringing us onto the exact same level. Without the height advantage of the platform, I realized just how tall she actually was. Even barefoot, she commanded the space in a way that made the cavernous room feel suddenly very small. "And what do you prefer, Sarah?" The question was simple, but it landed like a heavy stone in a quiet pond. Brides did not ask for my personal preferences. They asked for logistical miracles, catering budget cuts, and flawless weather contingency plans. They did not ask me to evaluate their beauty or their choices. My preference is irrelevant to the timeline, I replied, my tone clipped, even, and devoid of emotion. My job is to ensure you look exactly how a bride at the Ritz-Carlton should look on a Saturday evening in September. Emma took a slow, deliberate step forward. The subtle scent of her perfume, something warm like crushed fig leaves and dark amber, cut through the sterile, conditioned air of the boutique. That wasn't my question. Her gaze dropped to the crisped collar of my white dress shirt, then slowly trailed back up to my jawline. I tightened my grip on the metallic edge of my tablet. "I think we should move on to the Vera Wang collection," I said, taking a calculated step backward to restore our professional distance. But as I retreated, the heel of my stiletto caught the edge of a stray piece of tulle scattered on the floor. I lost my balance, just for a fraction of a second, my weight shifting awkwardly backward. Emma's hand moved faster than my brain could process the slip. Her bare fingers clamped around my forearm, steadying me with a sudden, surprising strength. Her skin was radiating an intense heat. It was a sharp, jarring contrast to the icy temperature of the room and the cold exterior I constantly projected. I froze completely. I was the one who directed people, positioned them, and moved them safely out of the way of the camera crews. I was absolutely never the one being caught. "Careful," Emma murmured. She didn't immediately let go. Her thumb moved. It was just a millimeter, barely brushing against the fabric of my suit sleeve, but the friction felt entirely magnified. "I'm perfectly fine," I said, my voice dropping an octave lower than I intended. I pulled my arm back, executing a slow but firm withdrawal. Emma let her hand fall gracefully back to her side. A faint, almost unreadable smile pulled at the corner of her lips, a look that told me she knew exactly what she was doing. "You always have an answer prepared for everything, don't you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "It's what your family pays me a premium for," I answered, smoothing down the front of my jacket to regain my composure. "I need a contingency plan for every possible scenario." "And what is your contingency plan for me?" The words hovered in the space between us, heavy and laced with a dangerous meaning I refused to acknowledge. I looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had signed my agency's contract 3 months ago. Beneath the cascading golden-brown waves and the polished veneer of a compliant society heiress, there was a fracture. I could see a quiet, simmering rebellion in those green eyes, just waiting for someone to strike a match. "You don't need a contingency plan, Miss Hayes." I tapped my tablet screen, forcing the tight schedule back into my immediate line of sight. "Your wedding day is going to be a flawless execution of logistics." Emma reached around to her own back, her fingers finding the hidden zipper of the gown. It was a complicated closure that usually required 2 assistants, but she pulled it down herself with ruthless efficiency. "Stop calling me Miss Hayes," she said softly. She let the heavy $100,000 gown pool into a careless heap of white silk at her ankles. She stood before me in nothing but a sheer, skin-toned slip. Yet as she stood there almost bare, she looked completely unbothered by her own vulnerability. "Emma, then conceded, swallowing the sudden inexplicable dryness in my throat. She turned to walk toward the frosted glass of the changing screen. but as she passed by, she paused right beside my shoulder. She was close enough that I could feel the ambient warmth of her body, close enough to hear the soft, rhythmic intake of her breath. "You don't really mean that, Sarah." Her voice was barely more than a whisper, designed only for the few inches of air separating us. "Mean what?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the mirror, absolutely refusing to turn my head and look at her. "That this is going to be flawless." She leaned in, just a fraction of an inch closer, her breath lightly ghosting against the shell of my ear. "I think you know this is going to be a disaster." Before I could construct a softly detached corporate response to shield myself, she stepped away. She vanished behind the frosted glass, leaving only the blurred shadow of her silhouette. I stood alone in the center of the vast room, staring at the discarded wedding dress left on the floor like a casualty of war. I looked down at my hands. For the very first time in my 7-year career, my fingers were slightly unsteady as I typed a note on my screen. And we still had 3 grueling months left until the wedding day. The grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton Central Park was a monument to old New York money. It was a vast, echoing space filled with gilded mirrors, intricate crown molding, and massive crystal chandeliers. I always preferred these venues when they were entirely empty. Without the chaotic energy of 500 guests, the room was nothing more than a blank canvas waiting for my precise instruction. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, tapping my silver pen against the edge of my tablet. Outside, the sprawling canopy of Central Park was just beginning to turn a burnt autumnal orange. "The floral mock-ups are ready in the center of the room, Ms. Mitchell," the head florist announced, stepping back from a massive display of white orchids and imported hydrangeas. I adjusted my glasses, scrutinizing the arrangement with a hypercritical eye. "The stems on the orchids are too long. It obstructs the sightline across the dining tables." "I can trim them by an inch," the florist offered quickly, eager to appease. "Make it 1.5 inches, and remove the baby's breath entirely," I instructed. Julian specifically mentioned he hated unnecessary filler in the initial consultation. "Let's be efficient about the revisions. I need this finalized before the bride arrives." But before the florist could even pick up her shears, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Emma walked in alone. She was not wearing the polished, conservative designer labels her future mother-in-law favored. Instead, she wore a loose black silk blouse, paired with wide-legged trousers and simple leather loafers. Her golden brown hair was tied in a messy, careless knot at the nape of her neck. She looked like she had just stepped out of a dusty art studio, not a billionaire's penthouse. "You're early," I noted, checking the digital clock at the top of my screen. "And Julian isn't with you." Emma walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, her footsteps barely making a sound. "Julian is on a conference call with Tokyo," she said, sounding utterly unsurprised by his absence. "He sent his deepest regrets and his Black American Express card." She stopped beside the towering floral arrangement, lightly brushing a finger against a pristine white petal. "He trusts you to make all the right aesthetic choices, Sarah. The contract dictates that both parties must sign off on the centerpiece design," I replied smoothly. I maintained my professional distance, standing securely on the opposite side of the table. "It prevents any logistical disputes during the week of the event." Emma finally looked away from the flowers and turned her piercing green eyes toward me. "Do you really think Julian cares about the height of the orchids?" "My job is to ensure he doesn't have to care," I answered, my tone crisp and unyielding. "I need your approval on the floral budget, the revised seating chart, and the dinner menu." I handed her a printed itinerary, waiting for her to review the carefully structured document. Emma didn't even look at the paper. She simply folded it in half and placed it casually on the edge of the display table. put my uncle next to the open bars, and serve whatever fish Julian's mother requested. She took a slow step around the table, closing the physical distance I had purposely established. I don't want to talk about centerpieces today, Sarah. This is a scheduled planning session, Emma, I reminded her, gripping my tablet tightly. If we don't finalize these details, we will fall behind the production timeline. You are obsessed with timelines, she observed gently, a faint smile playing on her lips. You build these perfect little schedules to keep everything completely under your control. Control is what prevents a multi-million-dollar event from descending into total chaos. Or maybe control is just how you keep people from getting too close. Her words hit me with the blunt force of a physical strike. I stiffened, my professional armor automatically raising its shields to deflect the psychological intrusion. I am your wedding planner, I stated clearly, dropping my voice to a sharp, authoritative register. My personal psychological profile is not on the agenda for today's meeting. Emma didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned slightly against the edge of the table, crossing her arms. You're right. You are my wedding planner. She tilted her head, studying me as if I were one of the abstract paintings in her Upper East Side gallery. But you're also the only person in this entire process who actually looks at me when I speak. The unexpected admission hung in the air, heavy and surprisingly fragile. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to remain locked onto the digital spreadsheet on my screen. Julian looks at you, I lied, knowing perfectly well that he viewed her as a corporate asset. Julian looks through me, Emma corrected softly, her voice entirely devoid of self-pity. He sees a merger. His mother sees a genetically suitable incubator for the next heir. She took another step closer, entering the unspoken perimeter of my personal space. The familiar scent of crushed fig leaves and amber washed over me, warm and intoxicating. But you, Sarah, you see every single crack in the foundation. I see logistical vulnerabilities, I countered, refusing to acknowledge the dangerous territory we were entering. If there are cracks in the foundation, it is my job to patch them before the guests arrive. And what happens if I don't want to be patched? Before I could formulate a safely detached response, a voice boomed from the back of the room. Ms. Mitchell, we're ready for the main lighting test, the AV director yelled from the control booth. Proceed, I called back, grateful for the sudden professional interruption. We are going to cut the main chandeliers to check the ambient uplighting, I explained to Emma, stepping back. It will give us a realistic preview of the dinner atmosphere. With a loud mechanical click, the massive crystal chandeliers went entirely dark. The heavy blacked-out curtains were already drawn, plunging the grand ballroom into sudden, near-total darkness. A second later, a soft, dim amber glow erupted from the baseboards along the walls. It was a moody, romantic lighting scheme designed to mimic a sunset, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floor. The sudden shift in the environment altered the entire dynamic of the room. It felt incredibly intimate, completely wiping away the sterile, corporate atmosphere of our meeting. In the dim amber light, Emma was no longer just a client on a spreadsheet. She was a breathtaking silhouette standing entirely too close to me. I told them to use a warmer filter on the lenses, I whispered, my voice betraying a slight tremor I instantly hated. It softens the harshness of the room. You're whispering, Emma pointed out, her voice dropping to match my lowered volume. We're the only ones down here. You don't have to whisper. I couldn't move. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to step backward, to turn on the flashlight on my phone, to demand the main lights be restored immediately. But my body refused to obey the commands of my mind. Emma slowly reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the silver pen still clutched in my hand. The contact was brief, but it sent a sharp, electric jolt traveling straight up my arm. "You spend all your time creating these beautiful, romantic fantasies for other people," she murmured. She leaned in, her gaze dropping to my lips before slowly rising back to meet my eyes in the shadows. "Don't you ever get tired of standing on the outside, watching everyone else live?" My breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound that was terrifyingly loud in the quiet darkness. "I prefer the outside," I managed to say, my voice tight and strained. "It's safe." Emma's fingers slid from my pen, lightly grazing the back of my hand. "Nothing worth having is ever completely safe, Sarah." Before I could pull my hand away, the heavy mechanical click echoed through the ballroom once again. The main chandeliers flared to life, flooding the room with brilliant, unforgiving white light. I blinked rapidly against the sudden brightness, taking a sharp, unsteady step backward. Emma was already standing perfectly still, her hands innocently tucked into the pockets of her trousers. The AV director called down from the booth, asking if the color temperature was acceptable. "It's fine," I called back, my voice sounding hollow and entirely unfamiliar to my own ears. "It's perfectly fine." But as I looked down at my hand, where the phantom heat of her touch still lingered beneath my skin, I knew the truth. Absolutely nothing about this situation was fine anymore. And for the first time in a meticulously planned life, I had no contingency plan for what was coming next. The neon glow of the digital clock on my glass desk read 11:42 p.m. I was entirely alone in my Midtown Manhattan office, surrounded by towering stacks of vendor contracts, seating revisions, and catering specifications. The silence of the floor was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clack of my keyboard as I tried to rewrite a timeline that suddenly refused to make logical sense. My mind kept wandering back to the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, to the amber shadows, and to the phantom weight of Emma's fingers brushing against my hand. I stopped typing, rubbing the bridge of my nose in sheer frustration. I was a professional. I built empires on precision, schedules, and emotional detachment. Allowing a client, a bride no less, to disrupt my cognitive baseline was an unacceptable operational error. I reached for my coffee mug, finding it completely empty and stone cold. Before I could stand up to reset my focus, a sharp, urgent knock echoed against the frosted glass of my private office door. I froze. No one besides the night security guard knew I was still in the building, and security never knocked with that specific frantic rhythm. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles of my charcoal trousers, and walked across the room to pull the door open. Emma stood in the dimly lit hallway. She looked entirely unglamorous and yet devastatingly magnetic. Her beige trench coat was unbuttoned, hanging loosely over a simple gray cashmere sweater, and her golden brown hair was slightly windswept, as if she had walked all the way from her Upper East Side apartment in the chilly autumn air. More alarmingly, I caught the faint, unmistakable scent of expensive red wine mixed with her usual fragrance of crushed fig leaves. "Emma!" I blurted out, a rare breach of my usual composed greeting. "What are you doing here at midnight?" "Julian's mother changed the guest list again," Emma said, her voice carrying a quiet, sharp edge of exhaustion. "She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply brushed past me, stepping directly into the sanctum of my office. She wants to add 45 senior partners from her husband's law firm, completely ignoring the venue capacity limits we established 3 weeks ago." I closed the door quickly, locking us inside the quiet, insulated space. "That's a logistical nightmare," I said, instantly sliding back into my protective professional gear. "The ballroom layout cannot accommodate an extra table without blocking the primary emergency fire exits. I will draft a formal rejection memo for Julian to review, first thing in the morning." Emma stopped beside my desk and slammed a thick manila folder down onto the glass surface. "Julian won't read it," she said, turning around to face me. Her green eyes were unnaturally bright, burning with an intense, restless fire. "Julian doesn't care about fire exits, or orchids, or whether I actually want to spend the rest of my life hosting charity galas for people I despise." She took a slow step toward me, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. "Then why are you marrying him?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, defensive whisper. I took a step backward, my lower back pressing firmly against the edge of the heavy wooden bookshelf behind me. "Because it's expected," Emma answered bitterly, stopping just inches away from my space. She was so close now that I could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest under the soft cashmere sweater. "It's what the Hayes family does. We sign contracts, we merge portfolios, and we smile for the cameras while our souls slowly rot from the inside out." "That is the reality of your social circle," I replied, forcing my gaze to remain steady, refusing to look down at her lips. "You chose this path the moment you signed the engagement papers." "Did I?" Emma tilted her head, a dangerous, melancholic smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Or did I just inherit a cage that someone else built for me long before I was even born?" She reached out, her hand moving with agonizing slowness toward my face. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to push her away, to cite our professional code of conduct, to remind her of the cameras, the contract, the groom, and the sheer impossibility of what she was doing. Instead, I stood there like a statue, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravitational pull of her presence. Her fingertips grazed the sharp line of my jaw, light as a feather, tracing a slow path down my neck until they rested gently against the collar of my white shirt. The sheet of her skin radiated directly through the cotton fabric, burning into my pulse point. "Your pulse is racing, Sarah," she murmured, her voice dropping to a low, intimate purr. "The great and unflappable wedding planner is losing her control." "I am simply calculating the risks of this interaction," I managed to whisper, though the lie tasted like ash on my tongue. "The risk is that you might actually have to feel something real for once in your life," Emma countered softly. She stepped even closer, pressing her body flush against mine. The contrast between her soft cashmere and the sharp, structured fabric of my suit was agonizingly clear. I could smell the rich, earthy scent of the wine on her breath, mixing with the sweet, intoxicating amber of her perfume. "Emma, stop this," I warned, though my hands remained flat against the bookshelf instead of pushing her away. "We are crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed." "Good," she whispered, her green eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding, fierce determination. "I am entirely sick of safe-lined and perfect boundaries." She raised her other hand, her fingers tangling slightly in the dark lapel of my blazer. She pulled me, just a fraction of an inch closer, her gaze flickering down to my lips before writhing back to meet my terrified, longing eyes. The air in the office felt entirely depleted, every molecule sucked out by the heavy electric tension crackling between us. My fingers twitched at my sides, desperately wanting to reach out, to grip her waist, to pull her closer and shatter every single rule I had spent a decade building my career upon. "If we cross this line," I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time in front of a client, "there is no contingency plan to fix the wreckage." "Then let it break," Emma breathed, her face hovering just a breath away from mine. "Let it all burn down to the ground." She leaned in, her lips parting slightly as she closed the final dangerous distance between our mouths. The heat of her breath ghosted across my skin, promising an absolute destruction of my carefully ordered world. Right as the microsecond approached where our lips would finally collide, the harsh, piercing ring of my office landline telephone tore through the suffocating silence like a gunshot. We both jerked backward, as if struck by a physical jolt. I stumbled slightly against the bookshelf, gasping for air as reality came crashing back into the room with brutal efficiency. The red light on the phone console blinked relentlessly in the dark. It was Julian, calling from Tokyo to discuss the guest list revisions. Emma stared at me for one long, agonizing second, her chest heaving, her eyes dark with a mixture of frustration, adrenaline, and lingering heat. Slowly, she let her hands drop from my blazer, taking a heavy, deliberate step back. "Answer your phone, Sarah," she whispered, her voice laced with a bitter, intoxicating edge. She turned on her heel, walking swiftly toward the office door without looking back. "We'll finish this timeline review tomorrow." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving me standing alone in the freezing darkness of my office, staring at the blinking red light while my entire world spun completely out of control. The private dining room at Le Bernardin smelled of expensive white truffles and bitter sea salt. It was 1:00 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 72 hours after the near disaster in my Midtown office. I had spent the intervening 3 days wrapped in a protective cocoon of spreadsheets, vendor conference calls, and 20-mile runs at dawn. I had convinced myself that distance, routine, and ruthless efficiency would successfully erase the phantom heat of Emma's fingers against my skin. I was entirely wrong. The moment the heavy mahogany door swung open and Emma walked into the room, my pulse hammered a frantic, unwelcome rhythm against my collarbone. She wasn't alone. Trailing half a step behind her was Eleanor Sterling, Julian's mother, a woman who possessed the terrifying social authority of old money Manhattan and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "Sarah, darling," Eleanor drawled, not bothering to offer a genuine smile as she took her seat at the center of the white linen table. "I trust the menu revisions I sent over via email at 3:00 this morning have already been implemented?" "They have been integrated into the master production schedule, Mrs. Sterling," I replied, my voice falling into its familiar, perfectly modulated professional register. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on my leather-bound tablet, deliberately avoiding the emerald gaze of the woman sitting diagonally across from me. Though I should note that changing the seafood course at this late stage will require an emergency renegotiation with our imported caviar supplier. "Cost is entirely irrelevant when we are curating an event for the city's elite," Eleanor dismissed with a flick of her diamond-ringed hand. She turned her attention instantly to Emma, who was sitting quietly with a crystal glass of sparkling water untouched before her. "And you, Emma, you look dreadfully pale today." "I didn't sleep well," Emma answered softly. Her voice was devoid of any defensive edge, carrying only a heavy, exhausted flatness that felt heartbreakingly fragile. "You simply must start taking your beauty regimen more seriously," Eleanor continued, her tone dripping with condescension as she picked up the silver menu card. "The cameras from Vogue will be capturing every single angle of the reception. A bride cannot afford to look lackluster, especially when marrying into a family with our public profile." A cold spike of irritation flared behind my ribs. I was accustomed to the transactional cruelty of high society weddings. I had spent a decade watching brides get treated like decorative porcelain dolls, traded away to cement corporate dynasties and social standing. Usually, I remained entirely neutral, a sighing ghost ensuring the logistics ran smoothly while other people's lives fell apart. It was the golden rule of my profession. Do not intervene, do not judge, and above all, do not care. "The lighting technicians have optimized the diffusion filters specifically to complement skin tones under natural daylight, Mrs. Sterling," I intervened, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the table with surgical precision. "Miss Hayes's appearance requires no artificial correction." Eleanor paused, lowering the menu card and turning her sharp, calculating eyes directly toward me. A heavy, suffocating tension instantly filled the small private room. Planners did not talk back to the matriarchs who wrote the six-figure checks. Planners nodded, smiled, and absorbed the collateral damage of elite neuroses without a word of protest. "I was not aware that wedding planners were hired to offer aesthetic commentary on the bride," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "I was merely clarifying the technical capabilities of our production crew," I countered, refusing to lower my gaze or shrink beneath her hostile scrutiny. "My job is to ensure every detail of this event is executed flawlessly, which includes protecting the bride from unnecessary logistical stress." Across the table, Emma slowly lifted her head, her piercing green eyes locked onto mine, burning with an intense, complicated mix of shock, gratitude, and something far more dangerous. The corner of her mouth twitched upward in a faint ghost of a smile, the first genuine expression I had seen on her face all afternoon. Eleanor let out a sharp, dismissive breath, clearly displeased by my lack of subservience. "Let us move on to the wine pairings," the older woman demanded, tossing her menu onto the table. "I want the 2012 Bordeaux served during the main course, not the vintage your agency originally proposed. The 2012 vintage is currently out of stock nationwide due to supply chain restrictions," I stated smoothly, tapping my tablet to pull up the inventory log. "I can source an equivalent French reserve from our private distributor by Friday, or we can proceed with the sommelier's recommended." "Find the 2012, Eleanor interrupted coldly, standing up from her chair with an air of absolute dismissal. "That is what we are paying your exorbitant agency fees for, Ms. Mitchell. Make it happen." She grabbed her designer handbag, turning on her heel and walking briskly out of the private dining room without a single backward glance. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind her, plunging the space into an abrupt, echoing silence. For several long seconds, neither Emma nor I moved. The air in the room felt thin, charged with the residual electricity of a boundary that had just been violently shattered. I let out a slow, controlled breath, instantly reaching up to adjust the collar of my blazer. "That was remarkably unwise of you," Emma said softly. Her voice broke the quiet, carrying a gentle, almost teasing warmth. I looked down at her, my professional armor feeling suddenly paper-thin and entirely useless. "My job requires me to manage difficult personalities," I replied, though the lie sounded pathetic even to my own ears. "Defending me to a matriarch with half the board of directors in her pocket is not part of your job description," Emma pointed out. She pushed her chair back and stood up slowly. Without the white linen table separating us, the vastness of the private dining room seemed to instantly shrink. She walked around the edge of the table, her footsteps unhurried, closing the physical distance between us inch by agonizing inch. "You broke your own rules, Sarah," she whispered, stopping just a foot away from where I stood frozen beside my chair. "I did what the logistics required," I insisted, though my hands were clenched tightly into fists at my sides to keep from reaching out. "You cared," Emma corrected quietly, her green eyes searching my face with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. "For 3 minutes, you didn't look at me like a client, a contract, or a deadline." She took one final step closer. The subtle, intoxicating scent of crushed fig leaves and amber washed over me, instantly dissolving every last shred of my carefully engineered detachment. "You looked at me like you actually wanted to rescue me." "I don't rescue people, Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to maintain control. "I plan weddings." Emma raised her hand, her fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch away from my cheek, trembling slightly in the charged air between us. "Then why are your hands shaking?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, devastatingly intimate murmur. Before I could find a single defensive word to shield myself, the private door swung open again. A restaurant manager poked his head inside, asking if we needed the dessert menu cleared away. We jerked apart instantly, scrambling backward as if we had been caught committing a crime of the highest order. Emma pulled her hands down, turning slowly toward the door while maintaining a mask of aristocratic calm. "No, thank you," she said smoothly to the startled manager. "We are finished here." She turned back to look at me one last time, her eyes dark, heavy, and full of an unyielding promise. "I'll see you tomorrow at the venue walkthrough, Sarah," she murmured softly. "Try to keep your armor on next time." She walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone in the silent, truffle-scented air, staring at the empty doorway while my entire carefully constructed world burned down around me. The cold autumn rain began to fall just as our production team reached Bethesda Terrace. It was 4:15 p.m. on a Thursday, exactly 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding date. The sprawling neoclassical arcade was usually crowded with tourists and street musicians, but the sudden downpour had cleared the lower-level colonnade, leaving the arched stone structure eerily quiet. I stood near one of the massive pillars, holding a black umbrella in one hand and my digital tablet in the other. "The acoustic testing for the string quartet needs to happen under the main arch," I instructed the lead audio technician over the radio. "Make sure the directional speakers are angled toward the fountain to prevent sound distortion." "Copy that, Ms. Mitchell." The technician's voice crackled through the static. "We're packing up the heavy gear now before the rain picks up. Do you need anything else down here?" "No," I replied, keeping my tone crisp and professional. "Head back to the vans. I'll finish the final site inspection with Miss Hayes and meet you at the exit." The heavy thud of footsteps echoed against the stone floor as the crew packed their equipment and retreated up the grand staircase toward 72nd Street. Within minutes, the echoing chatter of the production team faded completely, swallowed by the steady, rhythmic roar of rain cascading down the stone steps of the terrace. I turned around, my boots clicking softly against the damp mosaic tiles. Emma was standing a few yards away, leaning against the cold limestone pillar. She wasn't wearing her trench coat today. Instead, she wore a heavy charcoal wool overcoat that made her look remarkably small against the towering architecture of the park. Her golden brown hair was slightly damp from the mist, curling softly around her temples, and her green eyes were fixed entirely on me. "You're working them too hard," she said softly. Her voice carried easily over the ambient sound of the rain. "The crew has been on site since 6 this morning." "Precision requires repetition," I answered, stepping closer while maintaining a strict, professional 2-foot boundary. "If we don't test the acoustics under actual weather conditions, the sound quality during the processional will fail to meet the family's expectations." Emma let out a quiet, humorless breath. She pushed away from the pillar and walked slowly toward me across the mosaic floor. "My family's expectations," she repeated, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. "Do you ever get exhausted, Sarah? Do you ever look at all these color-coded spreadsheets, customized menus, and imported orchids, and wonder what the hell you're actually doing with your life?" The question struck too close to the raw, bleeding nerve I had spent a decade burying beneath layers of ruthless ambition. I tightened my grip on the edge of my tablet. "My life is entirely structured around my career," I replied, my voice dropping into a defensive register. "I build successful events. I deliver results. That is my purpose." "That's not a purpose," Emma whispered, stopping just inches away from my space. "That's an escape." She reached out, her fingers gently grazing the metal back of my tablet. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached past my hands and forced the device down, lowering it until it rested against my thigh. I didn't stop her. My arms felt suddenly paralyzed, heavy and useless at my sides. "Look at me, Sarah," she demanded, her voice dropping to a low, devastating murmur that vibrated straight through my chest. I forced my chin up, meeting her piercing green gaze directly. There was no aristocratic boredom in her eyes now, no polished veneer of a compliant society heiress. There was only an absolute, terrifying honesty that left me completely naked and defenseless. 2 weeks, Emma said, her gaze dropping briefly to my lips before rising back to my eyes. In 14 days, I am supposed to walk down the aisle in that $100,000 dress, stand in front of 500 strangers, and legally bind my entire existence to a man who doesn't even know what color my thighs are. That is the agreement, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. You signed the contract. I signed a piece of paper that was written before I was old enough to understand what I was trading away, Emma countered, her voice trembling with a quiet, suppressed rage. I spent my entire life being told where to stand, what to wear, and who to love. She took one final step forward, closing the remaining distance between us entirely. The heat radiating from her body cut sharply through the damp chill of the stone arcade. And then you walked into my life with your sharp suits, your cold professionalism, and your absolute refusal to be impressed by any of it. Emma, stop, I breathed, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. We cannot do this. Julian is your fiancé, and I am your... You are the only person who has ever truly looked at me, she interrupted fiercely. Her hand moved up, her fingers sliding lightly along the sharp line of my jaw before resting flat against my cheek. Her skin was warm, a searing contrast to the freezing autumn rain falling all around us. Every time you look at me, I feel like I'm finally breathing for the first time. The absolute sincerity in her voice shattered the final, fragile remnants of my self-control. For 7 years, I had prided myself on being the ultimate ice queen, untouchable, rational, and immune to the messy complications of human emotion. I had built an impenetrable fortress out of schedules, budgets, and ironclad boundaries. But as I stood there in the shadows of the Bethesda Arch, with the rain shutting us off from the rest of the world, I realized the fortress had already burned to the ground. I didn't pull away. Instead, my hand moved of its own accord, letting the tablet slip from my fingers to clatter harmlessly against the mosaic tiles. My fingers rose, trembling slightly to grip the thick wool lapel of her coat. Emma's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that mirrored the sudden, overwhelming rush of adrenaline in my own veins. If I cross this line with you, I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time in my professional career, there is no going back. The wedding is in 2 weeks. The scandal will destroy everything. Let it destroy everything, Emma murmured, her eyes dark with an unyielding, intoxicating resolve. I don't care about the empire. I don't care about the board of directors. I only care about this. She didn't wait for me to construct another defense. She closed the final, dangerous fraction of space between us, pressing her lips firmly, desperately against mine. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of years of repression, buried longings, and explosive, forbidden tension. Her lips were soft, yet carried an urgent, demanding heat that completely obliterated my thoughts. For a terrifying, magnificent second, the entire world stopped spinning. The roar of the rain, the looming threat of the wedding, the rigid expectations of high society, everything vanished, replaced entirely by the taste of her and the fierce, consuming pressure of her mouth against mine. I let out a soft, involuntary gasp, parting my lips just enough to let her deepen the kiss. My hands gripped the wool of her coat tighter, pulling her flush against my body as if I could weld us together and hide from the reality waiting outside our stone shelter. It was reckless, it was completely unprofessional, and it was the single most alive I had ever felt in my entire existence. When we finally broke apart, gasping for air in the damp, chunt space of the arcade, our foreheads rested gently against each other. My chest heaved as I tried to force my racing lungs to remember how to function. Emma's eyes were heavy, her lips slightly swollen, bearing the unmistakable mark of a boundary we had irrevocably shattered. You see, she whispered softly, a faint, triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth as her thumb gently stroked my cheekbone. You don't have a contingency plan for this, do you?
No, I whispered back, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I don't. Before she could lean in for another kiss, a sharp, jarring electronic chime cut through the quiet of the arcade. We both stiffened instantly, springing apart as if struck by lightning. I blinked rapidly, scrambling down to retrieve my tablet from the floor. The screen lit up brightly in the dim stone shadows, displaying a high-priority push notification from my agency's emergency messaging channel. It was a text message from the corporate concierge at JFK International Airport. Flight from Tokyo arrived early. Mr. Julian Sterling has cleared customs and is currently en route to your Midtown office. The blood instantly drained from my face, leaving me cold and rigid. Emma stared at the glowing screen over my shoulder, the warmth in her green eyes instantly freezing into a mask of grim resignation. The illusion was over. Reality had returned with terrifying speed, and our time was officially up. The taxi ride from Bethesda Terrace back to Midtown Manhattan felt entirely surreal. The rain smeared thick, distorted streaks of gray across the cab windows, blurring the towering glass facades of Madison Avenue into an unrecognizable haze. My heart was still hammering an erratic, frantic rhythm against my ribs, the lingering taste of Emma's lips burning like an unhealed brand across my mouth. I kept my hands tightly clenched in my lap, trying desperately to force my racing pulse back into its usual, predictable cadence. I was a professional. I managed multi-million-dollar productions, navigated impossible elite demands, and kept a cool head under absolute chaos. Yet, as the taxi pulled up to the curb outside my office building, my hands were visibly trembling. When I stepped off the elevator onto my agency's floor, Julian Sterling was already waiting in my private office. He didn't look like a man who had just endured a 14-hour flight across the Pacific Ocean. He wore a bespoke charcoal Brioni suit that looked as crisp and unblemished as if it had just been ironed, his gold Rolex catching the overhead LED light as he paced the length of my glass desk. "Sarah," he said briskly, not bothering to offer a greeting as I pushed the door open. "Good, you're here. We have a major complication with the media schedule." I forced my posture to straighten, instantly slipping back into the heavy defensive armor of the detached corporate planner. "Welcome back from Tokyo, Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice smooth, even, and entirely devoid of emotion. "What kind of complication?" "Forbes wants an exclusive photo shoot during the rehearsal dinner," Julian explained, tapping his phone screen with a diamond-encrusted signet ring. "They're offering a full cover feature, which means we need to bump the reception timeline forward by 2 hours to accommodate their camera crews." I walked behind my desk, sitting down in my leather chair with deliberate, calculated slowness. "Moving the timeline by 2 hours will disrupt every single vendor contract we have locked in," I countered, my voice falling into its familiar, authoritative register. "The caterers, the string quartet, the lighting crew, everything is synchronized to the minute. A change like that will incur substantial penalty fees." "Expenses are completely irrelevant," Julian dismissed with a wave of his hand, walking over to stare out the floor-to-ceiling window at the darkening street below. "The Forbes cover is worth 10 times what we're paying your agency. Just make the adjustments, Sarah. That's why we hired you. You're the best in the city at keeping everything under control." The words landed like a physical blow. Keeping everything under control. If Julian had any idea what had happened under the stone arches of Bethesda Terrace less than an hour ago, his calm, corporate composure would have shattered instantly. The sheer hypocrisy of the situation sent a cold, nauseating spike of guilt straight through my chest. Before I could formulate a safely detached response, the office door clicked open. Emma walked inside. She had changed out of her damp wool overcoat, now wearing a sharp, tailored ivory blazer and black trousers. Her golden brown hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe chignon that highlighted the sharp, flawless lines of her jaw.
She looked every bit the untouchable Upper East Side heiress. Yet, the moment her piercing green eyes met mine across the room, the pristine social mask vanished completely. A dark, intense flicker of secret recognition passed between us, invisible to anyone standing outside our orbit. "You're back early," Emma noted, her voice flat and entirely devoid of warmth as she looked at Julian. "Tokyo wrapped up ahead of schedule," Julian replied without turning around from the window. "And I wanted to make sure Sarah here is keeping your wedding planning on track. Forbes wants an exclusive spread, so we're altering the schedule." Emma walked slowly toward the center of the office, stopping just a few feet away from my desk. She didn't look at Julian. Her gaze remained locked onto my face, heavy with a silent, consuming weight. "Sarah always keeps things under control," Emma said softly, the words carrying a double meaning so sharp and dangerous that I had to force myself not to look away. "She is exceptionally talented at managing disasters before they happen." "Exactly," Julian agreed, turning away from the window and checking his watch. "Speaking of disasters, I need to take this call from our London branch before the markets open tomorrow." He pulled his phone from his pocket, walking toward the private conference area near the door. "Work out the Forbes timeline adjustments with Sarah, Emma, and be right outside in the hallway." The heavy glass door swung shut behind him, sealing him out of the room. The sudden silence in the office was deafening. For 3 seconds, neither of us moved. Then, Emma took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us with the predatory grace of a cat. She walked right around my desk, invading the private sanctuary I had carefully constructed to keep clients at arm's length.
I stood up from my chair, my breath catching in my throat as she stopped mere inches away from me. "You're shaking, Sarah," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register meant only for my ears. "I am under an enormous amount of logistical pressure," I lied, my voice strained and tight. "Julian wants a complete timeline overhaul with 0 notice." Emma reached out. Her fingers didn't touch my face this time. Instead, they brushed lightly against the edge of my desk, sliding past my tablet until they rested on the wooden surface right beside my hand. "You aren't thinking about the timeline," she murmured, leaning in just a fraction of an inch closer. The familiar, intoxicating scent of crushed fig leaves and amber cut sharply through the sterile office air. "You're thinking about what happened in the rain." "That was a mistake," I whispered, the words tasting like ash on my tongue as I desperately tried to cling to the wreckage of my professional code. "A catastrophic error in judgment that we cannot ever repeat." Emma let out a low, humorless laugh, a sound full of dark, unyielding defiance. "Error?" She took one final step forward, pressing her body so close to mine that I could feel the heat radiating through her tailored blazer. "Standing under that stone arch, kissing you while the rain fell around us? It was the only real thing that has happened to me in 27 years. "Emma, stop," I warned, though my voice lacked any real authority. My fingers twitched at my sides, desperately wanting to reach out, to grab her lapels, to pull her back into the dark shelter of my arms and forget that Julian was standing just outside the door. "He's right outside," I breathed, my eyes darting frantically toward the frosted glass. "If he walks back in, if anyone finds out—" "Let them find out," Emma interrupted fiercely, her green eyes burning with an intense, consuming fire. "Let the whole fragile, glittering empire burn to the ground. I don't care about the board of directors, the Forbes cover, or the wedding." She raised her hand, her fingers gently grazing my wrist, sending a sharp electric shock straight up my arm. "I only care about you." Before I could find a single defensive word to shield myself, a sharp, metallic sound echoed from the hallway outside. It was the distinct click of a door handle shifting, followed by the heavy, approaching thud of Julian's leather shoes against the floorboards. We froze instantly, springing apart like two magnets forced into sudden, violent opposition. I dropped heavily back into my desk chair, grabbing my silver pen with trembling fingers and staring blindly down at a blank digital spreadsheet. Emma spun around smoothly, walking 2 paces away to stand by the window just as the glass door swung open. Julian stepped back into the office, his phone still pressed to his ear as he barked an instruction about European asset allocation. He didn't even notice the suffocating, electrified tension still lingering heavily in the air between us. "All right," Julian said, lowering his phone and looking at us with absolute oblivious confidence. "London is handled. Have we sorted out the Forbes schedule yet, Sarah?" I looked up, my hands steadier by sheer force of will as I met his gaze, knowing full well that my entire world was balancing on the razor's edge of a catastrophe. The rehearsal dinner was held in the Grand Palm Court of the Plaza Hotel. It was a dazzling spectacle of crystal chandeliers, cascading white hydrangeas, and 500 of Manhattan's elite, all gathered to celebrate a union that felt less like a marriage and more like a corporate merger. I stood near the mahogany service bars, adjusting the clip of my wireless headset and reviewing the master timeline on my digital tablet. Every single detail had been executed with military precision. The string quartet was playing Vivaldi at exactly 65 decibels, the champagne was chilled to precisely 42 degrees, and the lighting was calibrated to cast a warm, flattering glow over every face in the room. Yet, as I watched the scene unfold from the shadows, a heavy, suffocating dread pressed against my chest. Julian was standing at the center of the room, laughing loudly as he shook hands with a senior partner from a rival hedge fund. Beside him stood Emma. She wore a breathtaking backless silver silk gown that caught the chandelier light with every subtle movement. She looked like a queen on a throne, untouchable, flawless, and utterly desolate. She hadn't smiled once the entire evening. Her piercing green eyes scanned the crowded room with a cold, detached indifference, eventually cutting through the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses to find me standing by the bars. When our eyes met, the air seemed to vanish from my lungs. She didn't look away, and neither did I. It was a dangerous, silent communication happening right in the middle of a room full of sharks, an unspoken rebellion written entirely in the way we refused to break our gaze. "Ms. Mitchell?" A young catering assistant stepped up beside me, holding a silver tray of canapés. "The head chef needs your sign-off on the dessert presentation before it goes out at 9 o'clock. I forced my eyes away from Emma, blinking rapidly as I dragged my consciousness back to the brutal reality of my job. "I'll be right there," I said, my voice dropping into its automatic professional gear. "Handle the staging by the northern entrance first." When I turned my head back toward the center of the room, Emma was gone. Her spot beside Julian was empty, replaced by a wealthy real estate developer and his wife. I frowned, a sudden spike of nervous adrenaline shooting through my veins. Before I could take a step to look for her, a light, familiar tap brushed against my shoulder from behind. "Looking for someone, Sarah?" The low, melodic voice whispered right beside my ear, carrying the warm, intoxicating scent of crushed fig leaves and amber. I froze. I turned around slowly, stepping backward until my lower back pressed gently against the cool wooden paneling of the service bars. Emma stood right in front of me, having slipped away from the crowd unnoticed. She was looking at me with a dark, intense hunger that made every single protective instinct I possessed scream in silent warning. "You're supposed to be accepting toasts at the head table," I whispered, my voice tight and strained as I scanned the surrounding crowd to ensure no one was watching us. "Julian is currently giving a 20-minute speech about synergy and asset allocation." Emma let out a low, humorless sound that was half sigh, half laugh. "Julian could talk to an empty wall for an hour and never realize no one is listening." She took a slow, deliberate step closer, invading the private space I desperately needed to maintain my sanity. And I couldn't stand in that room for another second, pretending to be a happy bride while my entire life is being auctioned off to the highest bidder. "This is your rehearsal dinner, Emma," I reminded her, clutching my tablet like a shield against my chest. "In less than 24 hours, you are walking down the aisle." "Don't say that." Her voice dropped an octave, sharpening into a razor edge of quiet desperation. She reached out, her fingers catching the edge of my tablet and forcing it down until it slipped from my grip, clattering softly onto the carpeted floor. I gasped. But before I could bend down to retrieve it, Emma stepped into the tiny gap between us, gripping the lapels of my dark blazer with both hands. "Emma, someone will see us," I breathed, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. "Let them," she whispered fiercely. "I am so tired of hiding, Sarah. I am so tired of playing the part they wrote for me." She didn't give me a chance to construct another defensive argument. She turned on her heel, her fingers still tightly gripping my blazer, and pulled me backward into the shadows of the narrow, unlit corridor leading to the service kitchens. It was a dead end, tucked safely behind a heavy velvet drape out of sight of the ballroom's glaring lights. The ambient noise of the party faded into a dull, muffled hum, leaving only the sound of our ragged, synchronized breathing echoing off the stone walls. I pressed my back against the firm plaster wall, my hands flying up instinctively to grip her wrists. "We can't do this," I whispered, though my voice lacked any real conviction. "The wedding is tomorrow. Everything is set, the guests are arriving, the contracts are signed." "Screw the contracts," Emma interrupted, her green eyes burning with an absolute terrifying intensity in the dim light of the hallway. She leaned in close, her face hovering just a fraction of an inch away from mine. "Look at me, Sarah. Tell me looking at the contracts is all you feel right now." I looked at her. I looked at the flawless silver gown, the tragic, beautiful defiance in her eyes, and the way her lower lip trembled ever so slightly as she waited for my answer. Every single lie I had told myself over the past 3 months dissolved into dust. "I don't feel the contracts," I whispered, the confession tearing its way out of my throat before I could stop it. "I don't feel any of it anymore." A triumphant breathless sound escaped Emma's lips. She didn't hesitate a second longer. She closed the final, agonizing distance between us, pressing her mouth against mine in a kiss that was fierce, desperate, and completely devoid of caution. It wasn't like the rain-soaked kiss under the Bethesda arch. This was heavier, more frantic, carrying the weight of a ticking clock and an impending catastrophe. My hands slid from her wrists up to the nape of her neck, my fingers tangling deep in her golden brown hair as I pulled her flush against my body. The taste of her was intoxicating, a sweet, dangerous poison that completely short-circuited every rational neuron in my brain. For a few breathtaking seconds, the entire world narrowed down to the friction of her lips, the heat of her skin, and the wild, untamed rhythm of our hearts beating against one another. I forgot about the venue fees, the seating charts, the Forbes cover story, and Julian waiting just on the other side of the velvet drape. There was only Emma, and the terrifying realization that I would burn my entire life to the ground just to keep holding her. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clatter echoed from the entrance of the service hallway. "Hey, is anyone back here?" a voice called out. It was one of the banquet servers looking for extra linen. We jerked apart as if struck by a bolt of lightning. I stumbled against the wall, gasping for air, my chest heaving as I desperately tried to smooth down the front of my blazer and drag my composure back into place. Emma stepped back 2 paces, her breathing ragged, her silver silk gown slightly rustling in the quiet air. She wiped the back of her hand lightly across her lips, a slow, dangerous smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, even as the footsteps drew closer. "Tell them I went to the ladies' room, Sarah," she whispered softly, her eyes locked onto mine with an unyielding, burning promise. Before the server could pull back the velvet drape, Emma turned and slipped effortlessly out through a side exit leading toward the kitchens.
I stood alone in the dark corridor, my knees trembling so violently I had to press my hand flat against the cold wall to steady myself. I bent down blindly, picking my digital tablet up off the carpet. The screen was cracked across the corner, the digital schedule glowing brightly through the spiderweb of glass. I tapped the screen, my fingers shaking as I looked at the countdown timer for the following day. 14 hours until ceremony. I knew then with absolute terrifying certainty that tomorrow's wedding was never going to happen the way they planned. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want it to. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been transformed into a breathtaking winter palace of white roses and glittering crystal, despite the brisk autumn wind howling outside the windows. It was 3:45 p.m. on a Saturday, exactly 15 minutes before the processional was scheduled to begin. I stood at the back of the massive room, adjusting the earpiece of my wireless headset and checking the master timeline one final time. Every single detail was executed with ruthless, surgical perfection. The string quartet was playing a soft, classical arrangement. The lighting was dialed to a warm, flattering amber hue, and 500 of New York's elite were quietly murmuring in their velvet-upholstered seats. Yet, as I stared down the length of the endless ivory aisle, my chest felt like it was trapped in a hydraulic press. Julian was already standing at the altar, looking every bit the triumphant billionaire in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man who was finalizing a lucrative corporate acquisition. He glanced down at his gold Rolex, then looked up at me with an expectant nod, trusting me to deliver his perfect bride right on schedule. I raised my hand, signaling the sound booth with a sharp, calculated chop of my fingers. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom slowly swung open. The low murmur of the crowd instantly evaporated, replaced by a collective, breathless intake of air as Emma stepped into the light. She was breathtaking. The $100,000 ivory duchess satin gown swept magnificently across the polished floor, trailing a 20-foot cathedral train behind her like a river of moonlight. Her golden brown hair was gathered in a loose, elegant chignon, and her veil caught the chandelier overhead, scattering tiny diamonds of light across her shoulders. She looked every inch the pristine, untouchable society heiress engineered for a billionaire's dynasty. But as she began her slow, measured walk down the long aisle, she did not look at the cameras. She did not look at Julian, and she certainly did not look at the adoring crowd. Her piercing green eyes were locked entirely onto me. With every step she took closer to the altar, my breath grew shallower, trapped in a terrifying vacuum of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I stood motionless beside the heavy velvet drapery, my fingers gripping my digital tablet so tightly the glass edge dug painfully into my palm. She was walking toward Julian, toward the multi-million-dollar empire, toward the cage her family had built for her before she was even born. Yet her expression was completely devoid of compliance. It was the look of a prisoner walking deliberately toward the executioner, carrying a hidden match behind her back. When she finally reached the front of the altar, Julian turned with a practiced, charming smile, extending his hand to receive her. Emma ignored his outstretched hand completely. She stopped 3 feet short of the platform, turning her body so she was facing not just the groom, but the entire sea of bewildered guests and the massive bank of television and magazine cameras recording every single second. The string quartet's music sputtered and died away, trailing off into an agonizing, unnatural silence. The elderly officiant blinked behind his thick spectacles, pausing mid-sentence as he looked down at the script in his hands. "Emma?" Julian murmured, his polished corporate smile faltering just a fraction at the edges as he stepped forward. "What are you doing? The cameras are live on the Forbes stream." Emma did not look at him. She turned her head slightly, her gaze cutting across the silent room to find me standing rigidly by the door.
"I have spent my entire life standing where other people told me to stand," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustic perfection of the grand ballroom carried every single syllable to the farthest corners of the room. I wore the dresses they chose. I smiled for the lenses they pointed at me. I signed the papers that bound my future to accounts I never opened and a life I never wanted. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of the congregation. Julian's mother stood up abruptly from her seat, her face draining of color as she stared at Emma in absolute horror. "Emma, darling, you are having a panic attack," Eleanor called out, her voice trembling with forced composure. "Minister, please continue with the ceremony. The bride is simply overwhelmed." "Sit down, Eleanor," Emma said, her voice dropping into a cold, terrifying register that silenced the matriarch instantly. She turned back to face Julian, her green eyes burning with an intense, long-suppressed fury. "I told you 3 months ago that this was a transaction," Emma continued, looking directly into the groom's stunned, darkening face. "And today, I am closing the account." She reached up with both hands, her fingers catching the edge of the expensive lace veil pinned to her hair. With one sharp, decisive yank, she tore the veil from her head, letting the delicate fabric float uselessly to the floor behind her. "I will not marry you, Julian," she declared clearly, the words echoing off the crystal chandeliers like gunshots. "I will not spend another second pretending to be a piece of property in your portfolio." Chaos erupted instantly. The ballroom exploded into a deafening wall of shouting voices, gasps of disbelief, and the frantic clicking of camera shutters as reporters rushed forward from the press gallery. Julian's face flushed a deep, violent crimson as he took a harsh step toward her, his corporate mask completely shattered by public humiliation. "Are you insane?" he snarled, his voice rising above the surrounding uproar. "You're throwing away everything, your family, your name, your entire future over a childish tantrum." Emma didn't flinch. She did not step backward, nor did she lower her chin. Instead, she turned her back entirely on the furious groom, leaving him standing alone at the flower-draped altar in front of 500 gaping witnesses. She began walking away from the stage, her heavy silk train dragging across the white rose petals scattered on the floor. She did not walk toward the exit doors leading out to the hotel lobby. Instead, she walked straight down the center aisle, her eyes locked entirely, unblinkingly onto mine. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, 500 pairs of aristocratic eyes shifting from the disgraced groom to the silent wedding planner standing by the door. Julian shouted something behind us, his voice cracking with rage, but the sound was completely drowned out by the roaring blood in my ears. Emma stopped right in front of me, standing less than a foot away in the middle of a catastrophic public disaster. The scent of crushed fig leaves and amber cut sharply through the heavy smell of panic and white roses. Her chest heaved under the low-cut bodice of her wedding gown, her face flushed with the terrifying, exhilarating adrenaline of absolute freedom. "Well, Sarah," she whispered softly, her green eyes shining with an unyielding, desperate challenge as the cameras flashed blindingly all around us. "You said you didn't have a contingency plan for this." She raised her hand, extending her palm toward me in the middle of the burning empire. "Are you going to run away with me now, or do I have to do this completely alone?" The entire world stood still, waiting for my answer while the foundations of Manhattan society crumbled at our feet. The flashbulbs were blinding. Julian was screaming something incoherent from the altar, his face twisted in a mask of incandescent rage. Eleanor Sterling looked like she was about to suffer a catastrophic medical emergency right there in the front row. 500 of the city's most powerful people were on their feet, gasping and shouting in absolute, unadulterated disbelief. But I didn't look at any of them. My eyes were fixed entirely on Emma's hand, suspended in the space between us like a bridge across an abyss. For 7 years, I had built my entire existence on safety, logic, and meticulous contingency plans. Every rule I lived by dictated that I should step backward, call security, and try to salvage the single most catastrophic wedding disaster in Manhattan history. Instead, I looked up into her emerald eyes. They weren't the eyes of a trapped society heiress anymore. They were wide, wild, and burning with a fierce, terrifying liberation. I didn't hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I reached out my hand and slid my fingers firmly into hers. Her grip was instant, fierce, and unbreakable, pulling me forward out of the shadow of the velvet drape and directly into the fire. A collective, deafening gasp echoed through the ballroom as our fingers locked together in plain sight of the entire elite establishment. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing?" Julian bellowed, starting to storm down the aisle toward us with his fists clenched at his sides. "Run," Emma whispered. And we did. We turned on our heels, leaving the multi-million-dollar altar, the ruined floral arches, and the howling groom far behind us. We sprinted down the long ivory aisle, our footsteps echoing off the crystal chandeliers and the shouting crowd. Reporters scrambled forward, their cameras flashing rapidly like lightning storms, capturing the ultimate corporate betrayal in real time. But their flashes couldn't blind us, and their questions couldn't touch us. We burst through the heavy glass doors of the grand ballroom, leaving the suffocating world of old money and transactional love gasping in our wake. We didn't stop until we hit the revolving doors of the plaza lobby, rushing past bewildered bellhops and startled hotel managers. The brisk autumn air of Fifth Avenue hit our faces like a physical shockwave. Without missing a beat, Emma reached down, gathering the heavy silk train of her $100,000 wedding gown in one hand, with ruthless efficiency. A vacant yellow cab was idling by the curb, its hazard lights blinking against the gray afternoon asphalt. Emma yanked the rear door open and pushed me inside before diving in right behind me. "Where to?" the driver asked, staring at us in absolute shock through the rearview mirror, taking in Emma's ruined veilless chignon and my disheveled blazer. "Drive," Emma panted, slamming the door shut with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Just keep driving downtown." The cab accelerated sharply, pulling away from the curb and merging into the chaotic stream of Manhattan traffic. I slumped back against the worn vinyl seat, my chest heaving as my lungs struggled to process everything that had just happened. The silence inside the cab was deafening, save for the hum of the engine and the distant wail of a police siren fading in the distance. I looked down at my hand. My fingers were still tightly interlaced with Emma's. The skin of her palm was warm, sending a steady, grounding heat through my shivering body. Slowly, I turned my head to look at her. Emma was leaning against the opposite window, her chest rising and falling beneath the low-cut satin bodice, a wild, breathless laugh trembling on her lips. There was no trace of the Kohl's untouchable gallery director or the compliant corporate bride. There was only her, radiant, messy, and entirely free. "We just destroyed a multi-million-dollar wedding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though I couldn't find a single ounce of panic in my chest. "We did," Emma agreed, turning her head to meet my gaze. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face, softening the sharp, aristocratic lines of her jaw into something achingly tender. "And honestly, it's the best event you've ever planned, Sarah." A sudden laugh broke out of my throat, bright and uninhibited, the first jolly sound of joy I had allowed myself in years. I reached out with my free hand, my fingers gently brushing a stray lock of golden-brown hair away from her damp forehead. "My agency is going to sue us into oblivion," I murmured, though my thumb traced the high curve of her cheekbone with absolute reverence. Julian's lawyers are probably already drafting the injunctions. Let them, Emma whispered, her green eyes softening as she leaned imperceptibly into the palm of my hand. We have enough saved up to start a new life anywhere on Earth, or at least enough to buy a very small coffee shop in Brooklyn. I don't know how to run a coffee shop, I pointed out, a playful edge creeping into my voice for the first time in my life. I only know how to manage luxury galas. Then we'll learn, she said simply. She slid across the vinyl seat, closing the remaining space between us until her shoulder pressed firmly against mine. The familiar, intoxicating scent of crushed fig leaves and amber washed over me, completely crowding out the sterile smell of the taxicab. Besides, you're the best planner in Manhattan, she added, her voice dropping to a low, intimate purr. I'm sure you can figure out how to organize a few pastries. I let out a soft sigh, finally letting go of the last invisible anchor holding me to my old, meticulously structured life. I shifted my weight, turning fully toward her in the cramped back seat of the moving car. My hands slid from her face down to grip her waist, pulling her close until there was no space left between us. Emma let out a quiet gasp, her arms wrapping securely around my neck as her gaze locked onto my lips. No timelines? I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the tires against the asphalt. No timelines, she promised. No spreadsheets? Never again. She didn't give me a chance to ask anything else. She leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss that tasted like sweet victory, absolute freedom, and a terrifying, magnificent future. It wasn't restrained. It wasn't hidden in the shadows of a rainy arcade or a dark office hallway, and it didn't need a contingency plan. It was wide open, blazing under the late afternoon sun of a city that suddenly felt entirely new. The taxicab sped southward down FDR Drive, leaving the glittering towers of Upper Manhattan and the smoking ruins of a transactional empire far behind. As the skyline of New York blurred past the windows in a wash of golden autumn light, I finally understood what it meant to stop watching life from the outside. I wasn't just planning a moment anymore. I was finally living one.
We left the billionaire empire behind for a yellow cab and the unknown. For the first time, I didn't need a contingency plan. Sometimes, the best chapters start when you finally break the rules. Where are you listening to this runaway romance from? Drop your city in the comments below.